All right. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Damian Wetzel. I'm the director of the Aspen Institute Arts Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for what I look at as a rousing welcome to a great artistic leader who is now happily ensconced in this fair city for, I believe it's less than a month, so we're getting her nice and early. And of course, I'm speaking about Melissa Chiu. Melissa and I worked together a little bit on a wonderful forum took place in Beijing, but I've mostly been an admirer from afar of her work. But an admirer I am. And there's bio, of course, and all that, and I'm sure you've all read that, so I'm not going to go into particulars. But let's just say that she's a distinctive voice, and she's bringing that voice to a very interesting possibility. I think running a museum in the capital, with all of the attendant obligations that come with that is a very specific challenge, and one that I know that she's more than up for, but I'm also greatly anticipating seeing how she surpasses it. Moderating today is Philip Kennicott, who we all know from his award-winning work at the Washington Post, but I would say on a personal level, I've gotten to know Phil through the Institute over the last 3 years, where he has frequently moderated really tough subjects for me about how the arts intersect with society. He did an incredible job working with Arthur Bloom, the founder of Music Corps, which does work through music at Walter Reed. And you know, on the surface of it, it sounds like, oh, what an easy thing to profile and say how wonderful this is. No, not so. To actually have a discussion that doesn't venture into a world that is, you know, overly trite and to think, oh, it's so nice, but rather to expose the values involved and the possibilities shows what Philip can do. He's also worked with us on art and prison populations, and he'll actually be moderating a panel for us at Lincoln Center next month. But it's my pleasure to welcome Philip here to talk with Melissa. We will follow the usual pattern of these things for those of you who've been here and those of you who haven't. They'll be in discussion together for the better part of an hour, at which point we'll go to question and answers, and we'll see how that goes. And I hope you enjoy it. So, Philip, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Well, it's my pleasure here to be with Melissa. As Damian said, I don't think it's even a month that you've been on the job, so I won't press too hard on specifics for what's going to be coming at the Hirshhorn. But I was struck recently by something that another recent arrival in Washington said. Those of you who follow Washington culture know that we're in a period of transitional leadership right now. We have, coming next year, a new secretary of the Smithsonian. We have recently arrived a new head of Lincoln Center, and we have Melissa at the Hirshhorn. The woman who's the new head of Lincoln Center, Deborah Rutter, Kennedy Center, sorry. I'm a former New Yorker, so I mix them up. And I often call Union Station as Penn Station and vice versa. It's the same thing. Deborah Rutter, the new head of the Kennedy Center, was speaking at the press club, and she said, quote, "I keep hearing Washington is more conservative. I'm going to push you on that." And I'm wondering, Melissa, if you can take that same pledge.
So, Philip, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I am indeed in my 4th week at the Hirshhorn, and I would have to say that most people have an expectation that the Hirshhorn have both bold ideas, primarily because the mission of the Hirshhorn is to present the art of our time, and we know that artists who produce art today are interested in a great many things, and some of them do actually challenge us in different ways. So it would be a yes.
Good. There is that perception that Washington is kind of sleepy, and the Hirshhorn's been through some tough times in recent years, but I'd like to just think maybe 4 or 5 years out in a general sense. What epithets would you like to see attached to the Hirshhorn? What would be its reputation within the larger contemporary art community?
Yeah. So we have an exhibition on right now called At the Hub of Things. And the title was taken from an Anish Kapoor work in our collection that is actually in the show. And I would actually say it's a great way of thinking about the Hirshhorns wanting to assume a leadership position, not just in terms of modern and contemporary art museums, but also museums in a general sense. I think no other museums but contemporary art museums have a real possibility to transform the field. If we think of museums in the 21st century, what can they be? What should they be? I actually think it's contemporary art museums that can think in a very forthright way on this subject.
Mm-hmm. We spoke a couple days ago just to get a sense of kind of what we'd like to talk about, and you said something that I hadn't really realized in an explicit way, which is that when the Hirshhorn was founded 40 years ago, the landscape for contemporary art museums was very, very different. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that has changed and how the Hirshhorn's role by necessity must change to follow that evolution.
Yeah. Well, I think the other day when we spoke, I also teased you saying that the Hirshhorn was actually around my vintage. So I wasn't actually around when the Hirshhorn was founded. I mean, I was kind of 2 years old or something like that. But, what I would say to that is that there has been an enormous transformation in the perception of modern and contemporary art. And I think when Joseph Hirshhorn was putting together his collection, there were far fewer collectors interested in this material. There were far fewer museums to exhibit it. In fact, when he was searching for a place to put his collection, he explored the idea of having the museum in many different parts of the US. And many other museums were courting him. In fact, the show in 1962 at the Guggenheim of over 400 of his sculptures was a real wake-up call. People all of a sudden realized that Joseph Hirshhorn was amassing an extraordinary collection, and in fact, in the 50s and 60s, was averaging on 2 artworks a day. That gives you a sense of how acquisitive he was. But I think back 40 years ago, it was just a wholly, entirely different art world. It was much smaller, and contemporary art was considered something of an elitist activity. And I think in the last decade, we've seen a huge transformation in the perception of contemporary art, largely driven by the outreach that a lot of museums have done to make contemporary art more available, I think, to audiences. And as we see the interests of a younger generation emerge, especially the millennial generation, we see much more of a connection to contemporary art because for them, the art being produced today speaks to them in a way that historical objects may not.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that the reinstallation of the third floor of the Hirshhorn has much more of a dialogue between kind of the prized works everybody knows from Hirshhorn's collecting and a lot more contemporary work. Now, that predates your arrival, but is that the sort of direction you would see in terms of the presentation of the permanent collection?
Mm-hmm. Well, our third floor renovated galleries they really enable us to show much more contemporary sculpture in conversation with painting. I think some of you who may have visited the Hirshhorn galleries before the renovation about a year ago would have noticed that the floors were carpeted and there were a lot of temporary walls that were built. The Hirshhorn is a very unique building. It's basically round galleries. And so some of the efforts on the part of previous curators were to create smaller rooms for appreciating the collection. And I think by removing those two elements allows us to show a lot more of the contemporary or recent acquisitions that are part of the collection, alongside some of the more modern works, early 20th century and beyond. So I think that it allows us to create, in a way, more nuanced conversations between work. There's a combination of kind of thematic arrangements alongside formal arrangements that allows us to think about the relationships and dialogues between works. It makes no claim to present a historical narrative. It makes no claim to kind of setting up a particular interpretation, if you like. It's really, what I love about it is it's open-ended. You kind of go into the space and you discover different works and, by their placement, different relationships between the works.
Mm-hmm. And do you see that permanent installation as being maybe less permanent than the old ideas of permanence in a permanent installation? I mean, do you see things swapped out, changed within it more often?
I mean, there's a great Ernesto Neto installation. He's a Brazilian artist that kind of came to international prominence in the 1990s. And we have quite an extraordinary installation of his. He's best known for large-scale stocking installations filled with polystyrene balls, so it's this all-immersive experience. And so we'll have that on display, but many of the works actually can't be on display for long periods of time, so you'll find that things will get switched out. But what I would say also, Philip, is that in my previous institution, we never had a static display of our collection. We kind of curated exhibitions around it, kind of felt like people should, when they visit a museum, always feel like they have a new experience. So I think that that's something that we'll explore more at the Hirshhorn.
Right.
Yeah.
Melissa mentioned this NATO work. The description of its materials doesn't quite get at the effect that it has. You have to imagine sort of pendulous things hanging from the ceiling.
Suspended from the ceiling, a
Extremely,
whole room full.
Yeah, it's very biomorphic. You kind of feel a little creepy after you've walked through it.
Really? Or you just want to dive into it, but I'm not saying that any of you should do it.
You know, it's interesting that the Hirshhorn, a lot of people forget this, but it's actually a kind of a great society project. I mean, its origins come out of the Johnson administration. He takes a very forthright role in making sure that the Hirshhorn happens, that it's going to happen in Washington. And, you know, he says that the city of Washington, the capital, needs a contemporary art museum. And that goes to this other question, and that is how museums in Washington, particularly contemporary museums in Washington, in the capital, how they differ from work in, say, a cultural capital that has that removed from policy and politics in New York. What do you see as particular to your mission here because we are in the city of Washington?
I think actually the biggest difference is that, and this is going to sound perhaps a little strange, but I'm used to in New York what I would say a much more heavily competitive environment. So if you're in an art world ecology where it's not just a coterie of different museums like MoMA, Whitney, Guggenheim, you also have other institutions who are historical institutions doing contemporary art, so it's refracted quite differently. And then you have the marketplace where Gagosian and other galleries are staging museum-type exhibitions. So I'm kind of used to that kind of environment, and so coming here to Washington, it's actually a great advantage to be the main game in town. So with that comes a great deal of responsibility, I think, and the fact that it is Washington. And so the implicit, I think, in being here in Washington is a certain kind of national or international representation. So on the one hand, you're looking across the US at, you know, what are the artists who we really need to be showcasing, either by acquiring their work for the collection or by putting their work in curated exhibitions. Or, on the flip side of that, what is going on internationally that we need to bring to Washington as the kind of gateway to the US. So I think that there's a different kind of, if you like, responsibility being here in DC and being the main contemporary art museum than, say, operating in a place like New York, where it's a kind of overcrowded scene. So you're always having to argue. In a way, operating in New York is every day you have to argue for your existence and your importance. So it's a very different mindset.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned New York, and your previous job was director of the Asia Society. And I was wondering, just what are the differences structurally, institutionally, between the kind of work the Asia Society was doing and Hirshhorn, maybe even in terms of the size of these two organizations?
So I think probably the biggest difference is that most of my work at Asia Society was, it was kind of looking at the Asia-US relationship, or it was work in Asia. And so it was always thinking about what was, on the one hand, going on here in the US that was important to Asia. But on the other hand, looking at a kind of region, an enormous region. And I'll never forget one of my colleagues from an important US institution. I had been 2 weeks, I had just come from Australia, I was 2 weeks on the job at Asia Society, and she said to me, oh, you know, don't you feel hemmed in by only dealing with Asia? And I said, to be frank, actually Asia is a lot more complex than a lot of other regions. It's like over 30 countries and many different issues to deal with. But so, you know, it was kind of a role that saw me, I think, have, you know, I traveled a lot to Asia. I ended up establishing facilities in Hong Kong and Houston, so there was actually a physical entity that I was responsible for. So it was a little bit different. I think here, rather than an external, if you like, overview, here what we're interested in at the Hirshhorn is both a national and international purview, but focused on a very strong sense of place, being the Hirshhorn building. And of course there are many opportunities, as we see, with what technology can do to link us to many others elsewhere. But really, I think the Hirshhorn, the strength of the Hirshhorn is the fact that we have a great collection and we have an all-immersive building. It's like nobody ever forgets that they went to the Hirshhorn. And I think in this, right at this moment, it's those kind of experiences that allow people to both encounter art, perhaps in a different way, but are, I think, a real comparative advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think your biography on Wikipedia says that when you were at the
Don't believe anything you read on Wikipedia.
I just had a crack yesterday.
I'm just kidding with you, Philip, but what does it say?
That you were the first curator of Asian and Asian American art.
That's true.
At the Asia Society. And that's a rather striking fact, that not so long ago, that was the first time somebody had that specifically as their purview. What does that say about kind of establishing Asian art, not just as a sideline or a subset, but as part of kind of the center of what we're thinking about in terms of art?
Yeah. Indeed, actually, that is true. So I will verify it. But thinking back to 13 years ago when I first came to the US, actually that was the very first curatorial position in an American museum that was devoted to Asian contemporary art. And so the way that I see it is that I was very fortunate to have kind of come into a field when it was just being formed. And so I was able to write a number of books. And, you know, one of the things that I often, when planning exhibitions at Asia Society, we would say, is this the first ever show? Because that's what is really going to make or break the reputation of the institution. And so I feel very fortunate to have been in, if you like, on the ground floor of Asian contemporary art as a movement. And I think what's so interesting is in this 13-year kind of trajectory, that in a way you could say that our work is done in terms of the field when you have, at the very same time, I think last spring, the Museum of Modern Art had a Gutai exhibition, and so did the Guggenheim. So two major institutions. When I started out, those institutions would never have considered showing Asian artists. And so you have, right, I think now we come into a period where this idea of globalization, I know we need to come up with other terms because it's kind of it's a term that's often used today, but I do think that at no other moment have we felt that that we can actually have a kind of discussion about artists who may have been born elsewhere and practiced elsewhere, but who are part of what we might describe as a canon in formation. So I think it's an interesting time, and it really started in the late 1990s with the whole development of the biennales, which allowed us to think about art produced in peripheral places like Sao Paulo or Sydney or Seoul. And so this is the efforts of, I think, over a decade of works. And so we're seeing the reprisal or the kind of retrieval of a lot of historical moments in the 20th century where there were these moments of international connections that were not written into kind of art history. That in fact, if you think of Gutai, it was in the 50s, and these artists were connected to Fluxus and many other international. So, I think that it's an interesting moment, actually. Yeah.
I'd like to get back to that, but maybe since we're talking about sort of transnational experience and globalization, your own background is really lived across borders and identities. And I was wondering if you could just fill us in a little bit about where you came from in Australia and how you got from, I think it's Darwin, to New York City.
Yeah, I know it sounds like quite a long journey, but so I was born in the far north of Australia. My father is Chinese. He left China for Hong Kong when the communists came, and so then actually went to Australia for university education. And my mother's Australian, and both of them somehow wound up in the far north of Australia for various reasons and had a family. And then for my education, we went to Sydney, and I did a number of degrees in Sydney, including a PhD in Chinese contemporary art. And I had set up a contemporary art centre that brought together a number of artists who were working throughout the region, Asia-Pacific region, and Australians. And the idea was that it was linked to that particular moment in the 1990s. So when I was coming of professional age, there was an enormous kind of very public cultural discussion about the identity of Australia. And the Australian government had actually put a lot of resources into wanting Australia to be part of the Asia-Pacific region, because you have to understand that up until that point, Australia really identified with Britain still. And so in many ways, I was a beneficiary of that kind of, if you like, that different political climate. And so I was interested in doing work in Asia and did a number of trips to China and many other places, but founded this contemporary art centre. And then and I had been on radio with Vishaka Desai, who was then the director of the Asia Society Museum when she came to Australia. And so she remembered me from that and called me up and said, we have a newly endowed position and we need candidates. And so the whole process actually took a year, which was interesting. And then one day she called me up and she said, are you sitting down? And I said, yes. And she said, well, how soon can you come to New York? Like in 2 weeks? And I said, give me a little more time to organize my things. But and so then I went to New York for this new position, and it was a very exciting time, actually. Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the current position. It's no secret that there's been some tumultuous time at the Hirshhorn, and I think many of us observing the last couple of years wondered how the search for a new director would go if the climate there is chaotic enough or hostile enough that it was going to scare off people. Tell me your thoughts as you realized that this job was open and you were approached about it.
So I think that it's true that if you Google Hirshhorn, some of the first things that come up are Washington Post articles.
I can't imagine who read those.
So that's true. But actually, if you set all of that aside, the fundamentals of the Hirshhorn are still fabulous. So an amazing collection that rivals many other museums. In fact, the Hirshhorn collection would be the envy of most other museums here in this country in terms of especially strengths in post-war American European art. It has a building that is completely unique. The only comparison would be the Guggenheim in terms of a rounded kind of exhibition space. And it's on the Mall. And it's part of the Smithsonian. So I think the fundamentals, and right at this moment in time, when the interest in contemporary art is so high, in broader society with a younger generation, this is no longer a kind of sideline activity, if you like. It can be seen as an important kind of contribution to civic society. And so that's kind of what drew me to the Hirshhorn. And, I've always been interested in kind of being able to shape an institution that has an international imprimatur and something that is very much about a statement about our time, and being able to shape an institution that has a 40-year history already is kind of interesting too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The controversy which I mentioned, if you haven't been following this, was about the plans to build what was called a seasonal inflatable structure, or temporary kind of bubble form, and a very interesting architectural firm in New York was hired to do it. And so a lot of people were very intrigued by this idea. And the bubble controversy essentially was two separate critiques. There's a critique of the space, the building, how to change the Hirshhorn's building to make it adaptable for some other usages. And then there was a more in-depth conversation about the future of the Hirshhorn. And that's the one, not to belabor it, and we'll move on to other things, but in the course of all this, the Hirshhorn lost, I think, 7 board members, including Connie Kaplan, the chairman of the board. And I was just going to read what she wrote, because it's very rare that when somebody leaves a position like that, they actually make a public statement. And I'd just be curious your reaction to it. She wrote a letter that then became public. She said, "I see the Hirshhorn abruptly regressing from the vision of serving as the nation's museum of contemporary art, retreating at a time when, precisely because of the challenges at hand, this larger role is more important than ever." When somebody new comes in, there's a lot of speculation. Are we going back to sort of the days of Jim Dimitrian? Are we going forward?
If only we could. No, but I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but yeah.
So how to formulate this as a question? I guess the question would be, do you have a mandate, given the current board and the Smithsonian leadership, to move forward, backwards, keep things calm, rile things up? Are you going to be, sort of swimming into headwinds, given what's happened in terms of these changes?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Jim Dimitrian, because when I told people that I was going to the Hirshhorn, I can't tell you how many people said to me from New York, "Oh, we used to fly from New York to DC for the openings when Jim Dimitrian was there." And so I think this idea of a national imperative is very important to us. I think Connie's comments were clearly made by someone who was very passionate about the Hirshhorn. And when I first came on board, I had read all of the writing that you had done, and many others. And I said, actually, you know what? It's actually a good thing. This shows how passionately people think about the importance of the Hirshhorn in this city and even beyond. So I think that that's a big plus. I think that the brief of the Hirshhorn is to be bold in its thinking. And I will say that I'm only in my 4th week, but I've had enormous support already from the Smithsonian, both in terms of staffing capacity and in many other areas that are really helping us to act more quickly than we would ordinarily be able to act as part of a Smithsonian entity. And I think that there's an expectation that the Hirshhorn has nearly always been ahead of the curve in terms of its thinking. If we think of a lot of the acquisitions that Jim Dimitrian made in his tenure, they were great acquisitions. If we think of even the bubble as an idea, it was a bold idea. I think that people want the Hirshhorn to play that role. Not all of those great ideas can actually happen, but we at least need to be seen to be generating them. And I think that people want that to happen.
One of the maybe strangely fortuitous things about the controversy is that it led also to the departure, or actually I shouldn't connect those things, but you will have a choice of a chief curator coming up. And it's rare, I think, that somebody comes into an institution and can not just be at, in the director's position, but also choose somebody who can have that, direct imprint. Tell us your thinking on how long and who, or at least what kind of person.
Well, let me start with what kind of person, because I think that this, whoever it is, it's important that they have a kind of, I think, a kind of internationalist perspective. So that would be very important, because I think that the Hirshhorn's always been very international, but today our idea of international is very different from 40 years ago. So I think that would be a very high on our list of priorities. I think the other side of it is that, contemporary art can sometimes be challenging and sometimes even difficult. And I think that the qualities that I look for in a chief curator is somebody who is willing to explain perhaps why the artist has chosen to work in this manner. Because I think, the curator's role in many ways is as a kind of interlocutor between the artist and the public. And I think that's a really important quality for a chief curator to have. And somebody who is very good at kind of team building, that we have 5 curators already in our midst with very different and varied expertise, all of them who have spent a long time looking at the collection and producing exhibitions. So it's somebody who can really foster the talent that we already have as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how long until we begin to see particularly your imprint on what's actually on display at the Hirshhorn? Is that a matter of years?
I hope not. I mean, here's the thing. Museums work on a much longer time frame. So in an ideal world, most museums are programmed out for 3 to 5 years. But, I think that we're working on a number of projects that we'll see, we're looking at a kind of short, medium, and long-term impact, and many of these are ideas that I have, and we're working with the curators and many of the staff to roll those out. And so I would say as early as the spring, you'll see something.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned the market. We talked briefly about that and how the market for contemporary art has changed and really exploded. And I'm wondering about your filters for making sense of what's new out there. There are museums, there are galleries, there are biennales. It's an enormous amount of material that's coming at you all the time. How do you keep in touch with emerging work, new work?
Mm-hmm. So, I think this is always the challenge, but also the great thing about being immersed in the contemporary art world, because there are so many opportunities to see art today, more so, I think, than ever before, whether it's in museums, galleries, at the biennales, or even art fairs. There are many convenings at which like-minded people interested in contemporary art, whether they collect or not, can attend. In terms of what I look for, I think, it's a combination of things, from other museum shows to visiting studios, artist studios, galleries. I think that we discover things sometimes in unexpected places. Probably if you had asked me 7-8 years ago, I would have said biennales, because I think a lot of interesting curatorial work was being done kind of outside the usual centres in unusual places. I remember an exhibition that Dan Cameron curated for the Istanbul Biennale, which was fabulous, where, I was less interested in the kind of museum type spaces and more interested in the places where he had got artists to think about the city And so it was almost like a kind of hunt for the work. You know, you'd have to go into the bazaar and you'd be lost for maybe half a day, and you'd finally find this amazing Mike Nelson installation in amongst a 17th century glass factory. So I'm actually, you know, I think sometimes seeing art also outside of that kind of white cube experience can be pretty fabulous. In fact, I did an interview recently with David Atje, who many of you would be familiar with, and you know, I asked him about, you know, because I was doing a book, and you know, the whole subject of the book was museums of the 21st century. What should they be like? And he said something very interesting to me, which was that he felt like the evolution towards the white cube was a very 20th century notion. And so I then said, so what do you think it's really going to be? And he said, you'd have to commission me. So we'll probably see something very shortly that is his vision of a museum in the 21st century. But what I would say to that also is that I think that there maybe, you know, there are also opportunities for just simply rethinking how we actually create an environment to see art. And we're all very hooked on this white wall, white cube. But the Hirshhorn isn't a white cube, so maybe that allows us to think differently as well. So, you know, just some things to think about.
Well, in terms of Adjay's vision, of course, it's actually rising as we speak. On the mall, you can see the big concrete supports that are already in place for the new National Museum of African American History and Culture. So I suppose we'll know the answer to that question in a year or so. I just want to return to the notion of filters for a second. And given how dispersed the art world has become, is the system working well in terms of actually identifying and promoting talent? To the extent that there's a system out there, whether it's curators or gallerists or people moving from the peripheries to biennales in Istanbul or Venice, is it a fair system in terms of the kinds of talent it finds and promotes? Is it a coherent system?
Fairness is a tough kind of thing to talk about in a marketplace, I think. What I would say is that the system as it is right now is pretty complex. It's very global. And I think it hasn't really been disrupted.
In a
yet.
good way?
It hasn't yet been disrupted in the same way that your field has been. And so we're talking about the art market right now. Actually, in the museum world, we haven't been, and this is much of the discussion that museum directors have at AMD and other organizations, is what is the disruption on the horizon, because we know it's all coming. So that's the debate. But if we talk about the marketplace, I actually think that the biggest disruption that is playing out right now is actually in the gallery system. And so what we've had is a kind of a global big blue chip gallery expansion. So Gagosian has galleries all around the world, as does many others, Pace, Hauser and Wirth, others. And so the galleries that have survived and prospered have got bigger and global. And then the auction houses are delving into online auctions. And so I would worry, just as I would worry about the kind of contemporary art center incubator level piece of the ecology, but also the kind of mid-scale, smaller to mid-scale gallery system, right? The galleries that used to take up artists, foster them early on in their career, and then the artists, and it was always a little bit bitter, but the artists may have moved on to larger galleries. But that's, I think, where the biggest disruption will occur, those smaller to mid-scale galleries, whether they will indeed be able to survive given the rising costs of having a physical space, like a gallery. The rents are very high in most metropolitan cities, right? So I actually think that so maybe there's a fork in the path. I don't know. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but I see something in if you look at where a lot of the new collectors congregate, it's at the top end rather than at the emerging end. So of art. So I'm not sure, but this is a question for all fields in a way. What are the changes on the horizon? Because I often think if you look at the 20th century, it wasn't until 1914, 1918 that the 20th century was truly felt. Like you felt like the technology was there and the real innovations. And so I kind of think we're right at this moment.
That's pretty terrifying.
No, I'm serious. We're kind of right at this moment where the changes that we've seen quite slowly now actually really start to speed up. Mm-hmm. So that's why I keep on saying these are interesting times we live in.
Well, you wonder if there's a kind of divergence going on between the art market, which is kind of running on its own apparently limitless resources of money, but gravitating to certain kinds of art, and the more sort of academic curatorial museum world. Do you see these two sort of trends continuing in parallel to each other, or are they sort of dividing off from each other?
I think that there used to be more consensus around particular artists. I do see something of a divergence between, not always, but sometimes between curatorial interests in museums and collector interest. And sometimes that's very easy to see, so most collectors would prefer paintings, and curators don't shy away from, difficult to install all immersive installations or large-scale sculptures. Usually it's a scale issue more than anything else, but I think it's also an interest in sometimes more conceptual pieces. But there are some collectors who have, in fact, more now than ever before, but who have in mind to kind of have their own private museums. So that has enabled them to collect in a way that museums might collect. So I do think that there is less consensus today about, which artists get validated over others. Just primarily, I think, because the art world is so much bigger. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's been a strong critique of the market that has come out of mainly people in my profession, people who write about art, not necessarily people who have to curate it or even people who can afford to buy it. And I wanted to read something that Jed Pearl wrote late last year in the New Republic, and it gets at a profound sense of disillusionment as people look at the market and feel as if the market has become something else, has become kind of exclusive. It's detached art from older forms of idealism and aspiration. And he writes, with the middle class in disarray, art is no longer embraced as anything close to an ideal. Art is just another hope to be abandoned, along with the hope that your children might do better than you've done. In place of art as an idea, we have art as an idol. Do people in your line of work feel as glum about where things are going as apparently people in my line of work feel?
I don't think we can afford to think like that. So Jed comes from more of a conservative view on things and has been very critical of artists like Jeff Koons. So, I think that I think it would be very difficult for people to work in museums and have that view of contemporary art, quite frankly. I think that you would, if you had that view about some artists, as a curator, you wouldn't show them. You would kind of avoid that spectrum of art making entirely. And there are some curators who have made those curatorial decisions. Let's not forget that in the 1990s, Jeff Koons also was fairly unpopular. This is a kind of a second wind to his career. So, and we could also talk about the vagaries of fashion in the art world. The art world is not immune to fashion. So, I think that for most people who work at museums, they go into it because they primarily love art and art history, but also enjoy working with artists. And I think that's the difference between an institution like the Hirshhorn and, say, a historical museum, that it is those relationships with creative individuals that can sometimes be nerve-wracking and terrorizing, but also very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in Washington, we occasionally fret about sort of revolving doors between government and the non-governmental sector. And there's been debate recently about the museum world as well, whether or not people who are prominent curators in a museum and then go work for Gagosian and then go back, if the revolving door blurs some of the boundaries between the sort of dispassionate decisions a museum makes and maybe the more commercially oriented decisions that galleries make. The question I have is the current understanding of ethics and kind of the unspoken rules of independence for museums, are they up to date? Are they where they need to be to keep museums independent as a voice?
That's a really good question, because I think most people who work in museums understand the ethics at play when it comes to acquisitions or even exhibitions. I think that it's probably challenged more today than ever before because of the strength. There are twin issues going on: the strength of the marketplace and the dependence that museums have on private philanthropy. Mm-hmm. And so I think most museums have an understanding of the ethical issues at play and do their best to uphold them. And I think that the challenge really comes about when museums find themselves in difficult financial positions. And so we've seen in the last 5 years, actually, not so much contemporary art museums, but other museums really have to debate big ethical issues about the sale of works and things like that. I mean, that deaccessioning, not kind of standard deaccessioning, but deaccessioning that, as we know, is for capital use and others, has been a big debate within the museum world. And that seems to be the hot button topic right now.
Do you think there's going to be a change in understanding of that particular rule?
From
there's
the
a taboo against this?
So there's a taboo for museums to see artworks as a fungible asset that you can sell in order to raise money for staff and building costs and things like that. So that's the taboo. And the Association of Art Museum Directors stands very firm on this subject, and I think most museum directors think that that's actually a good thing, because it makes it puts a museum in a very vulnerable position to see their collection as a fungible asset.
Let me move on specifically, because we're getting a little close to the time when we'll open up for questions. But I wanted to ask a bit about your scholarly work and the particular subject of Chinese art and Asian art that you've worked on your whole career. And I was just going to read something that appears in the introduction to a volume that you edited. It's a volume of short texts, I think meant for school use, or just an anthology of works on Asian art. And this is from a prominent critic at The New Yorker who, when faced with two major exhibitions of Chinese art, one at the Guggenheim and a Murakami show at Brooklyn Museum in 2008, he writes, "New Yorkers have a chance to absorb our new geo-spiritual fate as provincials in a world of creative paradigms that no longer entreat our favor." Remarkable amount of anxiety in that statement about precisely the sort of work you've spent your career studying and curating. Mm-hmm. How pervasive of force is that anxiety still in places like New York and Washington?
Well, it's funny, I love that quote because I could never get that critic to come to Asia Society when I was there. So I kind of know why, but I think that it was an indication that And we feel this a lot even in museums, that in fact if you want to call yourself international, it's a much more broader definition than it used to be. You know, for a long time, international meant going to Europe. And I would always somewhat frighten my museum colleagues when I would say, you know, New York is no longer the center, if you talk about the center, you know. So, I mean, I would say that I just think the kind of transformational shifts that we've seen in the geopolitical world have impacted on culture. And so in a way, that's what the critic is responding to, that things have changed, and it's like, okay, in a way the museums often aren't known for responding quickly, right, necessarily. So the fact that, and New York is not known for responding necessarily very quickly to change. So it was remarkable that at that given moment there was a Chinese artist and a Japanese artist at the key museums. And I think that critic felt a little left out because he didn't necessarily know those artists well. And one of them had a very difficult to pronounce name. So he was probably struggling with that as well. So I think that, you know, in my previous job, I spent a lot of time helping people to understand this other world, kind of trying to help people in a way. I mean, the mission was to educate Americans about Asia. But I see my role at the Hirshhorn as helping people to connect to the world through the prism of the Hirshhorn, which should be fundamentally international. And so, as I said before, that kind of idea of international has changed, and so the Hirshhorn should embody that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned an artist with a very difficult name to pronounce. Since you're here, and I have no shame, how do you pronounce Kai Gu-chang?
Oh, okay. Tsai Guo-chang.
Thank you.
It's tough. It's a tough name.
That's, you know, I always like to get some free advice out of these.
One more time.
Tsai
Tsai.
Guo-chang.
Tsai Guo-chang.
Yeah, Q is ch sound, yeah.
And a magnificent artist. I mean,
Yeah.
even if you can't pronounce his name. We can, however, pronounce the name Ai Weiwei, I think.
Yes, that's an easy one.
We've come up with something. There was a major Ai Weiwei exhibition at the Hirshhorn not so long ago, and I went there in the final days of the show, and it was packed. I went to another exhibition of Shubing in Richmond, and they kind of struggled to find an audience. And you mentioned a kind of winner-takes-all economy that's happened in the market with some of these larger galleries. Is the same happening in a sense with the artists from places like China that end up breaking through into the kind of public consciousness here? And if so, what does one do about that?
Well, it's interesting because I often think that in any movement or in any kind of way of writing about something that's happened, and I'm just using the art history that I was taught, there's really only room for 3 or 4 figures.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why. Maybe that's like our mental capacity, but you know, if we think of how Surrealism was taught, there are like 3 or 4 major figures, the same for Dada, the same for any of those movements. And so even with, as our world has gotten kind of enlarged and as people open up to the idea of the fact that there is a contemporary art, very lively contemporary art scene in China, most people, if pushed, would probably know 2 or 3 names, and Ai Weiwei would probably be top of the list, not just because he's an artist, but primarily actually because of his political activism. And so, you know, when it comes to other artists, in fact, many of them, when they show outside of China, they often struggle because people say to them, oh, why aren't you supporting Ai Weiwei? Why aren't you, you know, protesting against the government? Why aren't you doing these things? But for a lot of artists, they have either done it earlier on in their career, or they do it in a kind of implicit way in their work, or they're not at all interested in making those kinds of statements. So I just think that there is a certain capacity for knowing a certain number of artists, and Ai Weiwei is just, I mean, he's an artist who, you know, built his career in a way through the BBC. You know, he was a man who was constantly interviewed in the lead up to the Olympics as a spokesperson for, he was one of the few who would go on record against the government. And he spoke English. And he spent over a decade in the US, so he knew how the Western media operated. So I think there was a convergence of factors around his work. But what I would say is that his role as agent provocateur is true. It is authentic. From the very first exhibitions he was involved in 1979 through to an exhibition that he titled F Off. He always had that kind of impulse to go against the grain. And around 2008, he found another kind of platform which was much bigger than the art world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like there are kind of three periods maybe of Chinese contemporary art that we've seen so far. There's a sort of formational period in the 80s when there's a loosening of loosening of the strictures in China. Then the Tiananmen happens, and there's a period that people look at as maybe a more postmodern period, a more cynical period, a more reactive period. Now we're in this fascinating era where Chinese artists are, in fact, living in both worlds all the time. You know, they may have factories producing their work in China, they may have homes there, and have galleries and residences outside. How has this last period played out in terms of what they're making, their freedom to do what they do? I mean, they're crossing borders, but it seems like they would have to be very careful, at least in terms of maintaining their foothold within China at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, if you ask most Chinese artists, they would say that they've never had any issues. And yet, I saw the Australian Chinese artist Guo Jian here in DC a couple of weeks ago, and as you might know, he was asked to leave the country after creating work around the Tiananmen remembering, and the fact that he spoke to the Financial Times, I think, had something to do with it as well. So I think that with all of these things, especially in China, it's about the timing, and it's about what you're trying to say. And for most artists, they're not interested in a big political statement. Most of them are actually interested in, you know, some sort of commentary, or, you know, they have very individual interests, much as artists here do. So I would say it's a much expanded scene from when I first used to go there in the early 1990s. And I think the big new change is actually in terms of infrastructure development, that in the last 6 months alone, we've seen 5 private museums built in Shanghai. And then the Chinese government is also it's on a museum building boom, where actually about 5 years ago they said they planned to build 1,000 new museums, and someone has corrected me and said that their plans are now up to 3,000. So it gives you a sense of the scale that we're talking about. And I always think of museum building booms as, you know, we had in Europe 19th century, here in the US 20th century, and I think in the 21st century it will certainly be in Asia, because there are old civilizations in Asia, many of which predate anything that happened here, and old kind of empires and civilizations that are being excavated today. And then there are also very vibrant contemporary art scenes, and so many countries are actually investing quite heavily in a museum culture to be able to offer public access and preserve these things.
Let's open this up. I've monopolized the questioning for long enough. Anybody here want to? Sure.
Hello there. Thank you very much. I'm just fascinated. And you're a very beautiful woman, so you'll be gracing the Hirshhorn for sure. My question is, on Facebook with a wonderful artist, Richard Thomas Scott, they raised the question if the term contemporary is valid anymore, or is it now post-contemporary? So I was curious what your thoughts are. And a simple question is, might you consider bringing back Aiken's video on the outside?
Everyone loves that
loved it.
video
Yes.
project.
Yes.
We
it was
would love to
terrific.
do something like that again.
Yes.
So I would say that firstly, it was a big success and everyone enjoyed the way I think that the Hirshhorn building was activated
Yes.
by the video artist Doug Atkins. So there's that. In terms of the terminology of contemporary art, we get asked that a lot, in fact. And we also get asked, what's the definition between modern and contemporary? For now, we say contemporary is maybe anything from the 70s to today. But the terminology is quite varied. I don't know if, Philip, you have any thoughts on this?
I'm just glad I'm contemporary, apparently. Just sneaking in there.
I've said before, sometimes in discussions, it just seems humans have a propension to label, always have to label, to organize and to have this framework to understand.
Yeah, why do we
As-
obsess
Why,
about
yes.
these things so much?
It's a sense of order. We crave order, don't you think? Yeah. The world is disordered, but we crave order.
Here?
I remember that the Hirshhorn has two other letters in its name, SG, and I haven't heard you say a word about the sculpture garden. And of course, the other half of my question really is, since the Hirshhorn was created, the National Gallery has created a now vibrant department of contemporary art and a sculpture garden.
Yes.
Curious coincidence, perhaps. And I wondered if you had any observations about how your view of the sculpture garden and its connection under the Hirshhorn building
Yes.
might work out in the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah. So, Alan, I'm very pleased that you mentioned this because sculpture was one of the founding interests of Joseph Hirshhorn. In fact, when I mentioned the Guggenheim exhibition in 1962, it was 400 odd sculptures. So, in fact, the Hirshhorn has a very strong holdings of sculpture, and it does have a sculpture garden. And I think I'm interested in activating the sculpture garden, but my interest is not necessarily in kind of separating sculpture and the so-called sculpture garden from modern and contemporary art. So I think where the genres of painting and sculpture used to be so much heavily inscribed, so you would describe yourself as a painter or you would describe yourself as a sculptor, I think today most contemporary artists come up with an idea and then they may create a three-dimensional work or a sculpture, or they may make a video, or they may make something that merges the two genres. So I think we're kind of in a place today where those genre distinctions are much less current for contemporary artists. And so my interest is actually activating the sculpture garden in a less formal sculpture way. So we'll still have our sculpture, but maybe we can mix it up a bit. So.
And the changes to the third floor actually put out a lot more, make it possible to put a lot more sculpture, not necessarily the big outdoor sculpture, but show more of the collection.
Got it. Hi. I actually used to be the PR person there for a long time.
Oh, I
I'm
need to
sitting-
talk to you.
Oh, dear. Damage control. No, just kidding.
We had a show called Damage Control.
I know
by the
you
way.
did. I know, it's very good. The interesting thing about the mention of the sculpture garden is that, I'm sort of one of these institutional history people because I came just after the museum opened and left in 2003 as a PR person and did some curating also. is that it brings you back to the 19th century, which the permanent collection also does and did as it was presented.
Yes.
Until, then kind of the idea of us being a contemporary art museum and the modern part actually kind of got dropped.
Yes.
Because you could always talk about modernism if you're going back with the sculpture collection and a lot of the painters, the people like Calder and Leger is modern. But you don't really see those people there now, and I'm wondering what happens to the older precursors of the modern and contemporary genre.
Yeah.
And my second part of the question is film really, and media arts really taking over the contemporary field? Because if you go to the Hirshhorn, that's kind of what you come away with the feeling
Well,
about.
for now, we have
For
a
now.
temporary exhibition called Days of Endless Time. But let me address your question on the modern piece of it, because I think it's a really good question. We're in the process of planning a Surrealist sculpture exhibition, so it's early 20th century. And I think one of the big questions I have is, how do we actually connect that work that was essentially done nearly 100 years ago? And how do we let people know how radical it was? Because most of those modern movements of the early 20th century were incredibly radical like nothing we have today. I mean, today it seems like it's very hard to be radical. But those artists were, I mean, by all intents and purposes, they were kind of crazy people. They had these amazing, crazy ideas that today still are challenging. I mean, if we think of Duchamp's urinal, that is still a very challenging work it was made in 1913, it's a ready-made, and still we have people who question whether if an artist didn't make it, is it really art? And so that, in my mind, sets you up for a kind of a conversation on how we convey that period in amongst what else was going on at that time. And I think that that's a big question for museums, especially museums of modern and contemporary art that are not necessarily used to presenting social context. Most modern contemporary art museums are very interested in presenting objects in a very formal manner, and the white cube evokes a kind of form of display that divorces, and that was the whole purpose of the white cube, to divorce all of that other extraneous social, educational information. So I'm kind of interested in this question as a kind of philosophical question. So I would say that the Hirshhorn remains committed to explorations and scholarship of the early 20th century. What we're doing is trying to actually really look at things that have resonance today. So I don't think we would ever do a surrealism show for the sake of a surrealism show. It's very heavily mined movement already, but it's like, okay, how can we either shed new light on that period, or kind of put it through an idea of how what can it say, what can it teach us today, if you like. So, there are lots of different ways of looking at this, but we are committed. Yes.
This is a great conversation. Thanks so much for having it. If it's okay, I wanted to worry you a bit on the relationship between the museum and the gallery, and get back to this question of sort of, the extent to which it's hard not to feel that in the contemporary art world, the galleries are running the show. That artists enter the gallery system, they get picked up by big galleries, they start getting collected, and then they enter the museum circuit. So I'm wondering if that concerns you, if it was ever thus, if it could be any other way, and if you see a role that a museum could play where it could do sort of an end run around the gallery system. I mean, to me, the thing that Jed is criticizing in the piece on Koons and the Whitney is actually, yes, a critique of Koons, but a much larger critique, a Berger's critique of the role that the market plays in art world, and that art actually has become and is recognized first and foremost these days as a pure commodity. It's good not because it's challenging, it's good because it's expensive, and he wants it, and I want it, and that's how its value is determined. So to what extent are you interested, or what extent is there room for the Hirshhorn actually to short circuit sort of the gallery system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that things have changed in that there used to be a very set kind of, if you like, trajectory for artists, where they would finish at art school, they'd have their first show at the kind of artist-run initiative type laboratory space. Then if they were lucky, they would have representation from a gallery. And then if they were even luckier, they would be acquired by a museum, right? So there was a very set kind of, if you like, milestones to an artist's career. And I think that has been incredibly compressed. So what we have today is that a number of galleries actually go directly to the graduation exhibition and take up artists having no exhibition career, but just really graduating students. And then they're kind of propelled onto a kind of what I would describe as prime time. You know, there's very little room for them to experiment. And so that I think for an artist development is difficult. I think in terms of a museum's role in that, what I would say is that we have a series of works called the Direction series, which is all about giving artists their first chance in a museum to show, that is about emerging artists. And so that's kind of one way before hopefully, or perhaps, artists are represented by galleries. But I would also caution us from museums seeing themselves as kind of completely removed from the marketplace, because I don't think that's right or correct either. I think that we do play a role in the kind of art world ecology. It's more often than not a validation role, in that when an artist gets an exhibition at a museum, that's a big deal in an artist's career. I think that the system is just much more complex than it used to be, and I think that adding to that complexity is that a lot of other institutions kind of operate a little bit more like museums than not. So so there's a kind of mimicry going on, and a drift that even of staff and expertise. So Philip, you mentioned people going from museums to work at auction houses or galleries or whatever. So so where once that non-profit, for-profit bright line is no longer a bright line, there's much more drift back and forth. And I mean, the flip side of that, of course, is that museums have, in a way, their pool of supporters has grown. Actually, where once there were probably, 100 major collectors of modern contemporary art in this country, you couldn't count how many people are actually interested in collecting. So I actually see it sometimes as a positive view, in that if you're able to kind of position the museum in a way that it's unbiased, educational institution, you're able to actually build support for the exhibitions of emerging artists or historical modernist shows, but through this enlarged group of people who are potential supporters. So I kind of think, yes, it's a more challenging environment, but there also are opportunities for museums if you are able to see those burgeoning emerging collectors as potential supporters for scholarship. Then it's a good thing, yeah.
I think it's a good thing that we're at 1:30, because I don't get to ask my question about whether or not that burgeoning new world of collectors is as enlightened as the old world of collectors. I'll just not even bother. But I will thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Damien.
Yeah, I think it was just a fascinating conversation. I think we actually could have gone on for a long time, so hopefully we'll welcome you back to continue this at some point. Maybe we'll do it in tandem over there. but just so many questions about what you're going to do and how this is going to develop, and we're all looking forward to it.
So watch this space.
That's right. All right, thank you all for coming. I hope to see you at our next luncheon, which will be on November 19th, with another incoming head of DC Arts, Deborah Rutter from the Kennedy Center, who will be here on November 19th with me. Thank you so much.